What is going on, everybody? Tony Catalina here from the Austin American-Statesman with another episode of Behind Enemy Lines, a Texas A&M football podcast. Another episode brings another special guest with us. We have Connor O'Gara from Saturday Down South. Really sticking with the national view. I know you guys hear from me a lot. Want to bring in some big guns from the national side of things to talk A&M football. So first and foremost, Connor, thank you very much for joining us today.
Good to be here, man. I feel like I've not talked as much A&M this offseason as I feel like I've done in years past. Maybe that's a good thing. Maybe that's a bad thing. We'll find out soon enough.
Yeah, and so I'm glad you said that because everyone I've talked to who aren't as or isn't as close as I am, it's always fascinating to hear, right? Because I'm somebody who I'm not from Texas. I don't know the 8-4 A&M thing that everybody talks about. It's just not really like something I've like really spent my time or energy on. But it's really fascinating to see. And you cover the sport and you cover SEC football extensively. Like, how do you feel about the sense that somebody or a program can be viewed in a prism from something that happened, over 50-year sample size, right? Like Mike Elko in year two, Texas A&M football. Do you think it's fair for people to give them that, like, oh, they're just, it doesn't matter what they get, what doesn't matter what their class looks like, they're always going to be 8-5, 7, 8-4, whatever the case may be. Do you think that's a fair assessment of this team?
Forever's a long time.
Right.
It is. And even in college football, you can overcome forever. And I'll shed some light on my background here because it kind of lends to this discussion as well. I am not from the SEC footprints. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago and I went to college at Indiana, a program that last year decided forever meant absolutely nothing. And it had its best season in program history with a year one coach who basically said, "Oh, I think my JMU roster is good enough to play in the Big Ten." And then sure enough, it was. You wouldn't have looked at all those different pieces last year that Kurt Cignetti put together and said, well, that's a team that's going to go to the college football playoff. It took that year of defying belief and getting some schedule luck with it as well. That certainly benefited a program like Indiana. A&M is not necessarily going to get great schedule luck. It might catch some breaks here and there. I thought it caught some breaks last year with how big its home games were as opposed to its road games. But at the same time, it takes the right person to overcome that. I do think Mike Elko is the right person to overcome that. Doesn't mean that A&M is going to compete for championships in the SEC on a yearly basis, but does it mean that the ceiling should be viewed as higher than 8-4? Yeah. Maybe this year is the year that it can come together. Now, I certainly have questions about whether that's going to be possible. And Lord knows the last time we saw this A&M defense, Mike Elko was sitting there scratching his head in a post-bowl game press conference about why they couldn't figure out zone coverage. So I'm not going to pretend that's imminent either when we know the history and we know the more recent history, which is much more relevant for this team. But all it takes is one, man. All it takes is one. And we, as college football fans, have a tough time accepting that until it actually happens.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think Indiana is a great. I don't know if it's perfect because, like you said, the SEC, Big Ten, they'll never get like a schedule type of fairness, like you said, in that sense. But I think in this day and age of football, the transfer portal can even things up real quick. If you're willing to spend the money and you're willing to, hit on the pieces to bring in and you get the right guys in the building, you could change a program in overnight. And so you're right. When you look at this A&M team, the history, I mean, you said it perfectly, like forever, that's something that just you shouldn't really have in the back of your mind. I think fans have the cautious optimism, and that's fine. But looking at this talent and looking at this team, I think there is reasons to feel optimistic about it. And that's kind of where I wanted to start off with my first question here. Year two in Mike Elko's system, obviously new quarterback. They're bringing in new pieces. They get a top five class. A lot of momentum there, but where do you see the ceiling for this team this year? Like we can talk about 26, we can talk about 27, but in 25, where do you see this A&M team going?
I think it's a 9-3 ceiling. And I think that if you're wondering why the ceiling is higher than 8-4, I think you have to look at what has worked well in the post Johnny Manziel era, which is having stability on the offensive line, having a quarterback who knows what he's capable of, having a ground game that you can rely on, and then, oh, by the way, pairing it with a Mike Elko defense. All of those things are at play for this team. That is very possible. Mike Elko talked at SEC Media Days. I'm sure he's talked a lot throughout the offseason about how they have their top seven returning offensive linemen are back this year. Now, what's it going to look like with this backfield, which is expecting big things from Ruben Owens? How quickly is Le'Veon Moss going to be back up to speed coming off the torn ACL, which really I thought changed the way that they wanted to play down the stretch after he suffers that injury in their first big play of that South Carolina game where they fought furiously to come back. But obviously, it was a lot more difficult one of those nights at Williams-Brice. But I look at this team and go, man, they could be really similar to 2020 A&M, which was the best season in the AP poll in terms of finish since 1939. This is a team that can have all of those favorable things, even if there are still question marks about, hey, do they have that top end guy in the passing game that's really going to change how defenses defend them? Maybe Casey Concepcion can be that guy after coming over from NC State. Maybe Mario Craver can be that guy after coming over from Mississippi State, but we'll kind of wait and see. But the things that you feel good about are really similar to 2020. Now, you don't have the pandemic and all these different teams that are just trying to find a healthy body to play offensive line, and A&M probably won't benefit in the same sort of way of having stability in the offensive line with those Maroon Goons in the same way they're going to try to this year. But I still think that they can have an established identity in year two with Mike Elko, with the Colin Klein offense, and knowing that their ability to be able to win some of these close games could be defined by those things that they can lean on. There are so many teams in the SEC that I'm talking about right now, including one Tennessee, where you just wonder where in the world are they going to turn to in these key moments? What's their offensive identity going to be? I just got off to an Arkansas radio and I'm like, man, it's kind of all dependent on Taylor Green cutting down turnovers. And if they don't do that, this could be really rough for Sam Pittman this year. So A&M has that, and that's a huge positive that to me has set this ceiling at 9-3 with again November playoff relevance.
Yeah, and so I wonder if you feel the same way. I've talked about this all off season that if A&M didn't lose in four overtimes to Auburn, and we know that bowl games don't mean what they used to, but if the last sight we see from A&M football is Marcel Reed's game-winning go-ahead touchdown, and this team is 2 wins better, does the national perception of this team change, or are they just who they are, at least in the prism of the public opinion?
Yeah, I mean, that last season really came down to those what ifs. What if Ethan Burke doesn't get that big time stop for Texas on that fourth down play? I mean, there are just so many of these little moments for A&M that really I think define their season and in many ways didn't change the national perception of A&M, despite the fact that the Aggies were sitting there as the last SEC team without a loss in conference play. And we forget about how big that night felt at Kyle Field when Marcel Reed comes in there and just sets the world on fire in front of a national audience. And that's quickly forgotten when you have a very familiar November in College Station. And so overcoming that is going to be about being able to do those little things in those big time moments. And last year, A&M didn't do that. That's what it's going to come down to because the talent isn't really going to be a question. I think that defensively, there's a certain floor that a Mike Elko coach defense is going to have. And I still think that the pieces are there to be able to compete with a whole lot of teams in the SEC. And I don't really expect them to have a lot of games where they're just getting blown out and they look like they're no match. Even that game at Notre Dame, I still think they should be able to play a good competitive four-quarter game with the Irish coming off their runner-up season. So I just think that there are going to be these questions of until you overcome them in these small defining moments, people are still going to ask them. And it's really hard to change people's minds in college football until you actually give them a reason to do so. And this year has an ability to be that for A&M, but it's just not imminent.
Yeah, and so you had talked about some of the positives, right? You're talking about the offensive line coming back, 7 return starters, the stable and running backs, the new additions at wide receiver. So the reasons to feel optimistic are there and evident. But when you look at A&M, and we had talked about the history at the top, and we had talked about trying to figure out how to change public perception, but in a personnel scheme wise, what is some of the things that are going to be challenges for them? And does it really just all come down to Marcel Reed and his play?
Yeah, a lot of it does. The receiver questions are legitimate. They just need more explosive plays than what they got last year. They're going to be really portal reliant. And obviously when you lose a guy like Noah Thomas to Georgia, there's always going to be one eye peeking over in Athens to see how he's performing in that scheme. But so much of this is Marcel Reed. It just is. And when A&M put out that video the other day of, wait, we thought Marcel Reed couldn't pass. I'm sitting there going, all right, so we're just going to ignore the fact that he had an adjusted completion percentage of 27.8 on throws 20 yards downfield, which was second worst in the SEC. We're going to ignore the fact that he had 4.4 yards per attempt when under pressure last year, which was also second worst in the SEC. And those numbers really didn't skyrocket with the intermediate range either. So we're just going to pretend that these things didn't happen because I don't care. Like, whatever, you have a 300-yard passing game or not, whatever. You can still be very flawed even if you do check that proverbial box. But to me, I'm more concerned about whether or not Marcel Reed's going to be able to stretch the field, what it's going to look like when he gets pressured, because that's the thing that is always fascinating to me with young quarterbacks who are thrust into the SEC. What does it look like when they see that inevitable 2 or 3 man rush and they got to be able to dump it off, or they need to be able to make an accurate throw downfield? That's what impressed me so much last year about Lenora Sellers and what he was able to do when plays broke down. What is Marcel Reed doing in those spots? Is he still defaulting to his legs a little bit too much? He scrambled on 25% of the time that he was pressured last year, which you can get that number to work if you're a really good scrambler like Lenora Sellers was. But if you're scrambling at the rate that Jackson Arnold was, and if your accuracy in those situations isn't very good, then that's when we need to have a conversation. I think Marcel Reed did a lot of those really positive things year one, but to take that next step in year two in this Colin Klein offense, it does really come down to him and him being a more accurate passer, a more reliable passer to be able to elevate the play of his receivers, which not an easy thing to do. But if you're talking about competing for the college football playoff and competing for SEC titles, that's the type of play you need out of your quarterback.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad you brought up that social media post because I put it out there that I thought it was refreshing that they would kind of like take it on, but at the same time, you're putting kind of a bullseye on your quarterback, right? A little bit. So now he answered the very first question of fall saying, "I know I'm not a passer," or like that's the narrative. So one of those things is really fascinating to me, that they would do that because it seems unnecessary. Like sometimes you don't really need to dive into what the internet is saying, but in this case, like they dove in head first, and that they're gonna either sink or swim with that narrative. But with that being said, when you look at Marcel Reed, where is his ceiling? You talk about the team ceiling being 9-3, and they have a chance to break the 8-4 mold, but does Marcel have a chance to be a top five guy? Where do they need him to be? Does he even have to be that guy for this team to be successful?
Yeah, I would say, can he be what 2020 Kellen Mond was? Like, that was a guy who understood who he was, worked within the confines of the offense, a different offense that Jimbo Fisher ran. We could say that safely, and still played really smart football as a guy that was a veteran who gave you a chance week in, week out. And I think Kellen Mond kind of gets scoffed at because his NFL career didn't amount to much of anything. And, it's not like he was playing in an SEC championship or playing in the college football playoff, even though I did think that 2020 A&M team got snubbed. I would have had them in there over Notre Dame that year. But I think what's interesting is that the 4 years of post Kellen Mond, A&M has had multiple starting quarterbacks start multiple games each of those seasons. Can Marcel Reed just be a guy that stays on the field for this team? I mean, is that going to be kind of the exhale that the A&M offense has been lacking throughout the 2020s? Can that in itself allow A&M to feel like it can play to its ceiling instead of scrambling? Because even last year, I was a big Connor Wigman guy, and I was, even though there were questions about him, coming into the season, how it was going to fit with the Colin Klein offense. And that was obviously a bit of a mixed bag. But, you know, not being able to have the same starting quarterback last year, A&M was able to work through it. If that's the case this year, And if Mike Elko feels the need to turn to a guy that he likes a lot, and Jacob Zeno coming over from UAB, a guy that he's talked about being in what, year 11 of college, he's 29 years old. He's only going to be 25 this fall. But if he's turning to him and if he's not seeing these things out of Marcel Reed, then we're talking about a floor ceiling. If that conversation never has to come up after fall camp, and if we're not talking about how weird it was that Marcel Reed wasn't one of the 11 quarterbacks at SEC Media Days, or that Mike Elko clearly likes Jacob Zeno a whole lot, then that's going to determine if he's going to compete at an all SEC level. I do think he has an all SEC type ceiling, but it's going to be putting those deep passing game progressions together in order for him to actually reach that ceiling.
And I'm glad you said that. We could talk about Colin Klein here for a second. Obviously, he's somebody who likes the 12 personnel. Tight ends are very important in his offense. And when you look at the way this team is structured and built, whether it was Marcel Reed or me or you there, like having four running backs, you can turn the ball and turn around and hand the ball off to, and they should have an offensive line they believe is a Joe Moore worthy group. You know, when you look at this, having a year of an off season or having a full off season to work around Marcel Reed, the way that they attacked the portal with three tight ends additions and three wide receiver additions, like was some of it last year just they failed Marcel in that case, or they just it wasn't able to kind of do that? And is the floor raised because of the pieces and the movement they made this year to kind of make it a Marcel Reed friendly offense?
Yeah, I think Marcel Reed was a better scheme fit for what they wanted to do with Colin Klein than Connor Wigman was. And Connor Wigman liked to, he liked to be able to scramble, but you weren't really going to do a whole lot of the design runs for him. I know he had joked to one time to Bobby Petrino about if he reminded him of Lamar. It's just like, no, man, like your legs are okay, but they're nowhere near that level. I think what's going to be so interesting to watch is how much more comfortable does he feel? Because when Marcel Reed had his best moments last year, he didn't have to throw the football. People forget in that LSU game, he had two passes in that comeback. Two passes. That's it. Now, one of them was the deep ball that's just a thing of beauty, and it ends up being kind of the play where you knew like A&M is just it be an unstoppable force down the stretch in this game. There's nothing else he's going to be able to do, but he wasn't necessarily asked to be that guy. And what I will give Marcel Reed so much credit for, and this gets lost in the shuffle of people that just say, A&M had another one of those 8-4 regular seasons. Those two games that A&M lost, South Carolina and Auburn, where he's on the road, they dig themselves a huge hole early, and he has to come back. And if you're Colin Klein in those moments, you're finding out what your guy's capable of, because at that point, you're kind of throwing away whatever sort of pregame plan you had for him, because the script is out the window. You're not like 21 points. You need to figure this out. Otherwise, this is going to be a 42-point loss, and your team's not going to have a chance. Now, the Auburn game finished obviously much different than the South Carolina game, but people forget that A&M overcame that early deficit to South Carolina, where it looked like Williams-Brice was going to be a 2022 Tennessee game all over again. And if not for Marcel Reed's resilience in those moments, you're not getting to those places. But how well does Colin Klein know Marcel Reed? Because now he's seen him in a lot more of these situations. He's not the guy that he might have actually kind of favored coming into the season, but you feel like you owe it to Connor Wigman, the former five-star, to kind of see what you have in him and see if he can do enough of these things in your scheme to be able to make it work. Maybe a Jared Stidham, Gus Malzahn type fit offensively from a schematic standpoint that just didn't quite work in the end. But Marcel Reed should fit this better. He still needs to get better in those other areas. If he can do that, then I think we're going to be talking about the Colin Klein scheme and what it's been able to do the last few years, including his time at Kansas State, where they worked through having kind of a quarterback back and forth, Will Howard, is it Avery Johnson? I think we're going to be talking about it in a much different way, and as like a sign of Colin Klein knows what he's doing, and he's one of the premier offensive coordinators in this sport.
Yeah, I'm there with you, man. I really do think there is a chance this team could end up being, I think it could surprise some people, right? A lot of people are not talking about it with the same positivity that I see it. And like, obviously I'm here. And that's why I bring in people like you to kind of center me and be like, all right, like this team looks good. They do some good things, but like, let's be real about it. So I think you spoke about it in a real sense. So before we get out of here, I just want to put you on the spot a little bit. We talked about the floor is, we talked about the ceiling. What do you actually suspect? That you don't have to give me a record if you don't want to, but where do you think this A&M season shakes out in year two of Mike Elko's system?
For the sake of your reviews, I will opt out of saying 8-4 blindly. I will not do that. I will not do that. Lose all credibility if I just blindly say 8-4. I have my crystal ball series that I do for SaturdayDownSouth.com every year, where I go through every single game that an SEC team plays this season. I kind of break it down game by game, how I think a season is going to play out. A&M will be on the back end of that, so that'll be coming out in a couple of weeks. The series starts August 6th, and we just go in alphabetical order. One of the things I like doing about that is it kind of forces me into how I truly feel about a team. We could sit there at SEC Media Days, we could do our order of finish, but until we actually do like, oh, how do I think A&M is going to stack up against what Auburn would like to be able to do this year? It's tough to really gauge how you feel about a specific team. I tend to be more on the higher side than the lower side with A&M. I had him finishing sixth in the SEC. Now, there are a lot of people that will tell me that I'm crazy and that I'm putting too much faith in Mike Elko. I think so much of this comes down to I think Mike Elko knows what he's doing. I do. It doesn't mean he's always going to make the right decisions offensively. You always wonder how that's going to look with the defensive-minded head coach. Go ask Oklahoma fans about that. And they've been dealing with that with Brent Venables for the last couple of years here. But I think with Mike Elko, having a game plan and having that discipline is going to become a staple. It's going to become the identity of A&M in ways that it wasn't really with Jimbo Fisher. And I do trust that he's going to be innovative. He's going to be looking for solutions instead of digging his heels in deeper and deeper. And that gives you a higher ceiling of what you can do. Now, I'd like to see A&M win some of these big time road games. We'll kind of wait and see what it looks like. They're going to be able to go into Austin and win a game like that against Texas that everybody's going to have circled. I wouldn't sit here and tell you that I think something like that is extremely likely. But I do find myself being a little bit higher on the consensus. I'd like to see the defensive pieces on the back end and in the secondary look better than they look down the stretch. I mean, it was bizarre too as well that such highly decorated defensive linemen just struggled and couldn't get to the quarterback after we thought if there's one thing you can hang your hat on with this A&M team, it's those guys up front, Shamar Stewart, Shamar Turner, it's Nick Scorton, and then it just didn't prove to be the case. So I do that's a long-winded way of saying I think Elko figures things out in year two that he struggled to figure out at times in year one. I look at what Duke did year two, where they're hosting college game day. And before Riley Leonard gets hurt, we're like, dang, Mike Elko is on a steep, steep climb up to the top of the upper echelon, coaches in this sport. And obviously it all fell apart. But I think that this year ends up being a reminder that he knows what he's doing, and maybe that includes one or two of these wins that makes people nationally think that A&M is much better than they've been given credit for. But it should be a very up and down season, probably. That's what history has suggested. So I would bank on some of those moments, and I would also bank on those, every once in a while, one-score game where it's a team that you just shouldn't necessarily be on the field with, that you're having to try and find, a last-minute drive to be able to beat. I think all of those things are on the table for this A&M team.
Really, really well said. I mean, I'm there with you. I mean, peek behind the curtain. I had them sixth as well. So when I say I'm like this optimistic person, like it's sixth in the SEC. That's like, you know what I mean? So I'm not picking them to be like, this juggernaut in the SEC. But no, I think you're right on it there. And everybody who's listening to this, everybody who's tunes in, make sure you go check out Connor's stuff. It's Saturday Down South. It's great. Like you said, what was the date that's coming out? It's at the back end. So that'll be when?
Yeah, that'll be, gosh, something to do with August 20 something, like a
Okay.
20,
Yeah,
probably like August 20th or whatever. When you're pretending to work, and you're just looking forward to college football, they'll be rolling out right around that time. And
perfect.
I always tell people just like waste an afternoon, just click around SaturdayDownSouth.com, and it's better than working. I promise you that.
Perfect, man. I really appreciate your time. Connor O'Gara from Saturday Down South, man. It was a pleasure, my man.
Thanks, man. Appreciate it.
Take care.